G'day guys, E53 here, back with another video, and this one, as you probably would have guessed from the title, is going to be about F1 winter, their winter, Australian summer, off-season testing. They've just come to the end of their testing, and we're just starting to get a little bit of a picture about where everyone is sitting at the moment. So it's always a difficult thing to read into testing. There's a lot of sandbagging going on as far as the top teams are always trying to sort of hide what their true pace is and everything else, and they make rubbish comments in the media about who's quickest and who's not, always trying to hide their ultimate pace, whereas everyone sort of lower than the top 2 or 3 teams is trying to talk themselves up because they're trying to attract last minute sponsors and so on. So it's really 2 different approaches. So I'm going to go through them team by team, and what I'm going to try and do is create a little bit of be able to put them in order somewhat, a little bit of a hierarchy about where I think everyone's sat at the moment with so much smoke and mirrors going on. So if we take a look at the actual times, the fastest lap times, you can see there that we've got Ferrari up the top with Mercedes not too far away. No big surprises there. You'd expect those guys to be in the top 2. But the lower order is sort of surprising. You know, I don't think anybody looking at that graphic there, I don't think anybody expects that Red Bull are going to be right down there in the bottom area of the field. I don't think anyone actually thinks that's going to happen. So it's usually a much better way to look at it in terms of laps completed, and this is the number of laps completed per team. And this comes off the Sky Sports F1 website, and this was only last updated over after date 8. So they may have changed a little bit in terms of laps since then. But I think this is going to be a fairly good idea of where everyone's sitting, with the obvious outlier there being Red Bull, who are far lower than you expect them to be. But let's remember, of course, that Gasly's had a couple of crashes and has actually robbed that team of a lot of track time, so I would expect them to be a little bit higher. But anyway, we'll run through them team by team and really see if we can sort of make a little bit more sense of where everyone sat leading into Melbourne. Melbourne, of course, being a fairly unrepresentative track itself in the case of where everyone sits. You tend to get fairly random results there before the season proper really kicks off back in Europe. So alright, number 1, top of the tree, and this seems to be at odds a little bit with what everyone has been saying, but I think Mercedes-Benz, and that's going to be bad news, I suppose, for anybody who wants to see a bit of a change at the front, everybody who's a little bit bored with seeing the 2 silver cars out the front. In my opinion, we're up for more of the same this year. Mercedes, they've got probably the best driver in Formula 1 when he's confident and when he's in a good headspace, which he definitely is at the moment in Lewis Hamilton, and he's being backed up by Valtteri Bottas. No matter what the team says, Bottas is only there because he does not pose a threat to Hamilton while being good enough, in theory, to take points away from the Ferraris. I guess a sort of Schumacher-Barrichello scenario. All of this talk of that they're saying, I mean, everybody at Mercedes, even from Lewis Hamilton to Toto Wolff down to the tea lady, has been saying, oh yeah, you know, we're half a second behind Ferrari. I'm calling bullshit on that. There is no way that Mercedes are going to show up to Melbourne half a second away from Ferrari. I mean, these guys were sitting there saying that it's going to take us months to develop a new front wing. 2 days later, that a new front wing show up. You know, they're just talking a lot of crap, basically, to try and keep themselves out of the limelight, keep the FIA's attention away from what they're doing, because you've got to remember, all of these cars, especially the ones right at the front, are built on very, very special interpretations of what the regulations are. They all almost cheat, and if a team appears to be far and away the best, they know they're going to come under additional scrutiny from the FIA, and they may look to do something to slow them down, to bring them back to the pack. So, you know, we're not looking at a season of domination. They sort of don't say that they do that. They pretend they don't do that. They do that. So that's why the top 2 teams are definitely trying to play down their own performances. And I think if a Mercedes is not on the front row, I think both of them will be on the front row in Melbourne, but at least one of them is going to be on the front row in Melbourne. I'm picking Lewis Hamilton for pole straight up in Melbourne. And I really struggle to see how anybody else is going to take the fight to them consistently over the season. So for me, Mercedes-Benz up there in number 1. Number two, that can only be one team. It's Ferrari. Ferrari are sort of there or thereabouts. It's really hard to gauge where they are at the moment. They're very close to Mercedes, I think, but they always test really, really well. Ferrari, sorry. They always test really well. I think every year since 2010, they've come into Melbourne as the favourites, and occasionally they do actually win Melbourne, but then they sort of fall away over the season. And it's not an engineering problem with Ferrari, I think, that's actually stopping them for the last couple of years taking the World Championship. It seems to be a personnel problem, because the errors that they're making that actually cost them the championship last season were very human ones. You know, there was driver mistakes, there was mistakes in strategy and things like that. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with the car. The car was good enough to win the World Championship last year. Whether they brought a car in this year that's good enough to win the World Championship remains to be seen, but you've got to execute it. You've got to actually get the job done on race day. It's all well and good having a great car, but if you're not able to convert that into race wins and good places, then you're not going to win the championship. And I think from that perspective, Ferrari are definitely behind Mercedes in their processes and their personnel and so on. And I think from what we've actually seen in winter testing as well, I would say that the Mercedes is just marginally ahead of the Ferrari as well. So they certainly are on the lap count. So third team, and I think everybody's really kind of just making the assumption that these guys are third at the moment, and it's Red Bull, obviously, as it has been for the last couple of years. And their pre-season testing has been a little bit sort of hit and miss. They've been very quiet. Anytime that anybody talks to anybody from Red Bull, in the same way as Mercedes are talking themselves down, all these guys are talking about is how much they love Honda. And I think that is probably a lesson learned from the Renault days, where they did nothing but criticise Renault consistently. And now they're trying to say, oh yeah, you know, we've looked at the data side by side and we chose Honda. I'm also calling bullshit on that. I don't think they chose Honda at all. I think a few years ago, was it 2-3 years ago, when they actually split with Renault properly and started badging their engines as Tag Heuer, Renault had actually dropped them. They said, that's enough, we're out, we're not supplying you at all. Red Bull have expected that Ferrari or Mercedes would leap at the chance to pick them up. Neither one did. Probably a little bit to do with the fact that Mercedes and Ferrari didn't want to get beaten by Red Bull, because they know they're capable of that. But at the same time, they also use the public excuse of, well, look at how you treated Renault. We're not having you drag our name through the mud if you don't win, the way that you did with Renault. And I think that, to be perfectly honest, well, if you remember back from that particular period of time, it looked for a little while as though Red Bull wasn't going to have an engine. And then the FIA basically brought in a rule saying that if a team is left without an engine, the manufacturer that supplies the least number of teams has to supply that team. Now, at that stage, Honda had just started. They were in no position to come up and supply Red Bull. So, begrudgingly, Red Bull and Renault were kind of forced back together and so on. I think that contract with Renault ended, and Renault have rightly said, look, we supply enough teams now, Honda are established, we're not supplying you anymore, that is the end of our contract. That rule will be brought in about the manufacturer that supplies the least teams, and you have to take Honda. And I think that's the scenario, because I don't think that Honda are at the level of Renault yet. They talk about power output and so on, and they might be ahead in power output, but they don't seem to be there in a number of other ways. They've always struggled with their deployment. There's rumours just sort of swirling around the place about vibrations within that engine as well. Red Bull have run pretty reliably, but there's really no getting away from the fact that they haven't completed anything like the number of laps as some of the other cars. So I think Red Bull, they're third, but they're tentatively third. Let's see how that Honda actually performs on race day. That's going to be their Achilles heel, and I just wonder, with no other options of engine supply, how long the public patience with that will carry on, if indeed it turns out to be an issue. You've had Dietrich Mateschitz say before that he will pull out of Formula One if his team aren't in a position to be competitive and win. It might even come to that, but very early days. So at the moment, I'm putting Red Bull third, but it's a tentative third. Now we get into the tricky stuff, because everyone seems to be of the opinion that the midfield is very, very tightly packed. But I'm going to pick Renault as the fourth place team at the moment. And it's not because they finished fourth last season, and it's not because they are right up there in the lap count as well, and it's not because they're right up there in the lap times at all, actually. It's because if you look back at them finishing Renault fourth last season, they only did so because Force India, which is now Racing Point, changed ownership and lost all their points, and also Haas had a couple of disqualifications for illegal bits and pieces. So they weren't a genuine fourth place. This season, I think they're going to be fourth place. I think the arrival of Daniel Ricciardo is going to spur them on hugely. And they appear to have made good gains with their engines, although in the speed traps that's not showing so much. But they have set really, really good times. That they were very, very fast through sectors 2 and 3 at Barcelona. They appear to have a really good car aerodynamically, and that's going to help them well. The car seems to be really, really light on its tyres as well, which is obviously a good thing, except in cold temperatures where they can struggle to get the temperature into them. But I'm putting Renault a solid fourth at the moment, just slightly clear of the rest of this midfield battle. So fifth place, and realistically it could have been any one of two teams. I'm going to put Alfa Romeo in the fifth position. And the reason for that is a couple of different things. It was very touch and go between themselves and Toro Rosso, because the Toro Rosso, as I'll cover in a second, has a lot of carryover parts from last year's Red Bull. But I think with Alfa Romeo, I think the fact that they are so closely tied with Ferrari now, they're getting so much from Ferrari. The engine's Ferrari. It's a sister brand with Ferrari, all owned by Fiat. And they're going to be getting the best of the best of what they're allowed to get from Ferrari without necessarily being allowed to beat Ferrari. They've got Kimi Raikkonen in the car. They've also got Giovinazzi, who I actually rate fairly highly. He didn't get a chance to show too much in his couple of race outings so far, but I actually rate him as a driver as well, and I think he's going to come along really well under Raikkonen. And I think that those two together are really going to push that team forward. And even if their car is not necessarily the equal of the Toro Rosso, I think that those two drivers, Raikkonen in particular, is going to be enough to actually get them to fifth place in the championship. Of course, now that leaves in sixth position is Toro Rosso. And as I mentioned, they're going to be using a chassis which is very, very heavily influenced by the Red Bull. But on the driver's side, we've got Kvyat, who's been fired twice, I think now, by Red Bull, and brought back in. And he knows that this is make or break, so he's got to be motivated, but he also carries a little bit of that history along with him. So it's very tricky for him, I suppose. He's really got to stamp his authority on it. I haven't really been convinced by anything Alex Albon has done so far. He seems to be somebody who's been drafted in, much like Red Bull say that Gasly has been brought in too soon. They didn't want to bring him in this quickly, but their hand was kind of forced because Ricciardo left. I think the same with Albon. I think they've kind of picked him because he was there. They obviously didn't want to continue with Brendan Hartley, so they brought in Albon on the off chance that he's got to be really good. I'm not convinced. So I think that driver pairing, despite what the car may be very, very positive, the Honda may work out great, but there's too many question marks over those two drivers for me, so I think that they will actually slot in behind Alfa Romeo. So the next pairing is actually very difficult to pick as well. I'm going to go for McLaren, but McLaren are next. And the reason I put them there is they just seem to have taken a little bit of a step forward. I think that science is going to be good for them. Obviously, they've lost the monster that was Alonso there, dragging every last point out of that car. I think Lando Norris, it sort of remains to be seen what he's going to do. The team certainly rate him very highly. The reason that I put these guys up where they are is that I think there's the three teams that are going to be behind them, each experiencing their own troubles. So the only real reason that I'm putting McLaren here is the car looks solid, the driver pairings are solid, and that's more than I can say for the teams behind them. So that's where they are. Alright, so next up is going to be Haas. And when you think about it, Haas actually came to Melbourne last year with the fourth fastest car. They failed to convert that. They had those two pit stop dramas, but they had a decently competitive car the whole way through the year. Their drivers have their moments, but they're quite solid. I think that Haas are going to suffer because of Ferrari's tighter relationship with Alfa Romeo. Haas was, I guess, the closest to Ferrari last season in terms of that relationship, the parts they were getting supplied. They have now dropped to third in that pecking order behind Alfa Romeo. I think they're going to suffer with that. And this tie-up with Rich Energy is just... It seems a little bit bizarre. Like, you see the launch where they had everyone around, and just the guy there for Rich Energy, he looks bizarre for a start with that gigantic beard. But not only that, they just seem to be... I mean, I've been watching Formula One for a long time. I first got into it in the sort of late 80s. And in that period, you had a lot of small teams pop up, and some shady sponsors kind of work their way into the sport about that point as well. And they tended to make these big promises to these smaller teams, and the smaller teams would get dollar signs in their eyes, sign up this big title sponsor, and they'd never actually deliver. And then, eventually such and such would get done for fraud, and the whole thing would fall apart, and the team would go into an abyss from which they'd never recover, or it would severely hurt them. And I obviously hope that doesn't happen to Haas, because I like Haas, I like them as a team, but this relationship with Rich Energy is just weird. So we'll see how that turns out. I mean, they say, we produce 90 million cans of drink, but nobody's ever actually seen one. I mean, if anybody's actually ever bought a can of Rich Energy, can you please post below and let me know that this actually exists? Because as far as I can tell, nobody's actually seen this stuff. So it just seems weird. And I think that combined with the closer relationship between Alfa Romeo and Ferrari is going to be a problem for Haas, and that's why I think they're going to fall a little bit down the order this season. So that leaves us with two teams, and it can really only be one that's next, and that's going to be Racing Point. Now, of course, they were very much in contention for top 4 last season. And the reason why I think they're going to fall so far is just the turmoil that they have been through in the last season. They had the Vijay Mallya had his financial trouble, and the future of the team was very much in doubt until it got rescued by Lawrence Stroll and that group of investors that they have there. And I just get the feeling that was all going on around about the point that the new car is being designed, and not knowing if you're going to have the money for this, that, or the other. There was no money in the bank. That must have hampered their preparation. That must have hampered the build of the new car. And I think that the new car is going to be behind the 8 ball from the beginning, just because of that issue that they were having months ago with the ownership. There was no cash flow there. Obviously, they've got a fair bit of cash now, so they can start investing and moving forward. And that group of people, that group of staff there at that team, all the way back to when it was Jordan, have always done more with less. So if they do get a decent budget behind them through Lawrence Stroll, we know he's got more money than God, they should be able to climb back up the field. They should be able to develop as the season goes on. I think they're going to start the season behind the 8 ball, and it's going to be very hard for them to recover from there. So I'm putting them in second last place. Also, in terms of their drivers, I mean, Perez, he's obviously solid. He's a bit Giancarlo Fisichella, where he always gets a good result out of a bad car or a midfield car. But as we saw in his season with McLaren, you put him in a top car and he's not much good. So, well, he didn't do much, let's say that. So I think he'll be the man to drive that team forward for sure. And jury's still out on Lance Stroll. I think that shadow of having Daddy paying his way is never going to leave him, unfortunately, until he starts to put in some major results. There's always going to be that doubt over Lance Stroll. But we'll see what he can do. I really hope that Lawrence Stroll's influence in that team doesn't really result in Stroll getting priority as far as the upgrades and everything goes, because not to give those to Perez would be a huge mistake for the team. But we'll see what they do. And unfortunately, that leaves the team that everybody agrees is in last place, a team that seems to be really struggling on every single front at the moment, and that's Williams. And it's really, really hard for me to say that, because Williams is the team that I grew up watching dominate. You know, the Mansell, Hill, Prost, all the great drivers that have been through that team. And of course, Alan Jones was there too, which is a little bit before my time. But to see that they have fallen to absolutely dead stone last is something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. And sadly, it's reminding me a lot of what happened with Lotus. And it seems to be the case of what happens when a team, an independent team, is built around their one strong figurehead. So Lotus had Colin Chapman, obviously, and when Colin Chapman went, the team went into decline. Williams, obviously Frank is still there, but he's not running the show anymore. Claire is. He's very much in the background. He's certainly getting on a bit, Frank, and he's really handed over the reins to Claire. And it's not the fact that, it's not for me to sit here on the outside and judge the job that Claire's doing. I don't know the inner workings of that team. It'd be wrong of me to comment. But when the team is just so emotionally tied, I suppose, to that one strong figurehead that it's always been, and of course it was built around Frank Williams and Patrick Head. Patrick Head is no longer there. He's moved on. And that really seems to have coincided with the decline of the team. They were sort of up there. I think they finished third or fourth in 2014, 2015, something like that. But that was because they had the Mercedes engine in the back, and the Mercedes engine at that stage was far and away the best. Now that these other manufacturers have sort of closed up, Williams has been found wanting in terms of the quality of the construction of the car. And I also, despite what the rules say, I don't really think that they're probably getting the most attention from their engine supplier either. So as well as the car being late and everything else, it really points to that team being in disarray. And it's really got the potential to really sour what has been a miraculous comeback from Robert Kubica, obviously having had that rally accident so many years ago. And now he finally gets a chance to come back into Formula One, and if this car's terrible and it's running around at the back, it's really going to sour that fantastic achievement that he's made in coming back. And no one's really going to be able to judge it, because when you've got a terrible car, the drivers generally just get to that point where they can't get any more out of it. So it wouldn't surprise me to see Russell and Kubica running very, very similar times. And then the questions are going to start to be raised, and it might not even be anyone's fault. It's just the fact that the car's not good enough and it's behind schedule. It really points to disarray in the background at Williams. Of course, they've lost Martini. They've lost the Lawrence Stroll money as well. It's hard to see any positive points. I guess one positive point for them is when the car has hit the track, it has been reliable. They've come there and they've smashed out over 100 laps almost every time they've taken the track. So they haven't had any major mechanical glitches. The car seems solid, it's just slow. So that's basically where I believe everything sits at the moment in terms of the actual hierarchy coming into Melbourne. As we know, Melbourne can be a little bit of an outlier in terms of the actual results and being representative of the rest of the season. But I think from what we've seen there, I think the order that I've given you is going to be a fairly solid order to take with us into Melbourne in the first races of the season, and then the development race will be on, and we'll see what everybody else is able to do. But of course, with the limited testing and so on and so forth, there's only so many changes and so much development that can get done these days. But that's the order as far as I'm concerned. So agree, disagree, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more bits and pieces, more random thoughts, random musings, and sim racing rubbish from me, then please hit subscribe and you'll be notified when the next video comes along. Thanks very much. See you next time.